want to have a discussion today around what happens when companies choose to prioritize enhancements and features over truly solving and tackling some of the tech debt that they've accumulated over the years. Tech debt is not a passive choice, right? Nobody chooses to accumulate tech debt. Tech debt is a very active and conscious choice that companies make because they don't prioritize handling and fixing what the root cause of the problem is. They only want to continue masking and putting a band-aid over the root problem because unfortunately sometimes the band-aids or enhancements or features are the things that make money. Upgrading a dependency does not make money in the company's eyes. So sometimes all those things get pushed way off into, next year, 2 years, 3 years down the road until they absolutely have to be fixed because they're going out of support. And sometimes you'll see new support contracts be drawn up because companies wait so long that they're in the spot where they're in a scramble at the very end of life of a service or product, and they don't have enough time or resources to get on to the next one because of the breaking changes that the new feature or the new service or product introduced. And so they find themselves stuck, right? They can't update because they don't have time to fix all the things in the code to accommodate all the breaking changes. So they have to negotiate and work out a very, very expensive service contract with whatever company it is. You can look at service contracts for old version of Windows, and you'll see a lot of those come up. And honestly, it's unfortunate that those even exist because those things should be a very, very high priority. But unfortunately, like a lot of you and I see in the world, software engineers are viewed as an expense to the company. And I think what happens because of that is the things that we suggest doing to maintain and enhance products are not things that, in their eyes, generally generate any kind of revenue. And so when we suggest, hey, we need to upgrade a dependency, we need to get on the next version of this framework, we need to upgrade our servers, we need to upgrade our database, those things are probably going to be written down and take note of, but unless we really, really push every time we talk to all the higher up people in the company, those things are going to be pushed on the wayside because it's hard to justify all the time that it takes to invest into upgrading versus the time it takes to make that really quick enhancement that's going to generate, X number of dollars for us. And it's hard to make that sales pitch because I think they might see it as a little bit of bias coming from developers, like, oh yeah, of course you're going to suggest, bumping to the next version because you want this new feature. Well, that might be true like half the time, but the other half of the time, it really actually is out of necessity. Like that new feature that we would get in the new version of whatever we're upgrading to might be a nice just quality of life improvement for us, but on the other side of the coin, it might actually be a necessity because the feature that we're using now is actually a deprecated feature, and it's not going to work if we upgrade our server or if we upgrade the database. It might have introduced a breaking change that this old dependency relies on, and now those two don't talk, and the connection's broken, our app crashes. That happens all the time. And one instance that you'll see this happen in is if you live in like the .NET world, is if you use Entity Framework and you use older versions of databases. Sometimes older versions of Entity Framework made, we'll say, accommodations for some features that used to exist in databases, but then the later versions of databases changed their implementation of that. One example of this is if you look at the later versions of Entity Framework with how they handle contains. Older versions of SQL Server handled contains differently, and if you try to use an old version of, if you try to use a new version of Entity Framework with an old version of SQL Server, it might break things that you didn't expect. Your contains clause might actually fail, and you're not going to catch it if you didn't read the release notes for bumping to the next version, right? Because increasing versions is not a menial task, right? It's not as simple as going into your CS proj and bumping that version up to, from whatever your version is now to whatever LTS version it is. It might be that simple, but if you have a lot of dependencies, odds are it's probably not, because you might have some legacy code in there that's going to be greatly impacted by bumping that version up. And trying to sell that to companies is extraordinarily difficult until it breaks, because companies don't see that as a viable way to spend money. And it's unfortunate. So I think us as software developers and engineers, we have the responsibility to make that sales pitch whenever we can, because it's important, and we have to illustrate, we have to say, okay, our app is going to break if we don't do this. And we have to just say that as many times as it takes until people begin to believe us. And one way to show this happening is if you have a dev or test environment and you do any kind of stress testing or load testing, or you increase the version of the dev and test environment to whatever version you're trying to get to, and you can show, okay, see, this is going to break here, and if we push this out to production, it is going to break, but we have to push this out to get into long-term support for whatever we're using. And another instance of this is security. So there's security vulnerabilities popping up all the time, especially in older versions of packages that relied on old technology. And so if you ever look at, like, if you use GitHub to handle your projects, you might get those like dependabot alerts that were like warning you about security vulnerabilities in packages. If you've ever pushed up a node, if you ever pushed up like a React project with npm packages, you probably get those package vulnerability warnings saying, hey, this version has a vulnerability, we suggest bumping to this. Those aren't just like things that you just dismiss all the time. You can dismiss the warnings occasionally, but when they actually become serious and when there's actually legitimate flaws that need to be fixed, it comes to a point where it's actually unsafe to not do those patches or not bump to the latest version. Because companies, software is a growing thing, right? It's not just once and done. We don't just make something and then never touch it again and just, it just works for the next 30 years. It's not how it works. Things require constant maintenance. It's just like a car. We don't just buy a car and never take it in for oil change, or never take it in to get the tires rotated or any of the fluids changed. If we did that, then our car, the engine might seize. We might blow, a head gasket or something, or we're going to run with no oil. That's not good for the engine. So this software is the same way. It requires active maintenance and active participation on the part of software engineers to sell maintenance to whatever executives or managers that we need to do. And it's not just because that we're trying to be difficult or we're not trying to add the features. Sometimes I fear that us pushing maintenance and tech debt things is a way for us to avoid having to do any work. I think that sometimes that's how it's seen. And I don't think that that's true at all, because I think that it takes more planning and more effort on our part to update and maintain than it does to add features to an existing product. Now, obviously, that varies depending on what kind of software development you do and what kind of products or services, or if what kind of programming you do. Maybe it's embedded systems. It just wildly depends. But I think that talking about this more openly and more frequently with a greater audience is only going to help our cause in terms of getting more stable software pushed out, but more up-to-date software pushed out. Because the fact that websites like the one for that, I forget what the name of it is, but the fact that websites that exist that tell you how to upgrade from really old versions of React all the way up to the latest ones and show you all the manual interventions you have to do in code and what dependencies work and don't work, and it's just so complicated. The fact that those websites exist is kind of sad, because we just let the things run out, and we just let them get into a state where they're so, they haven't been maintained for years. They still work, but it's impossible to develop in because everything breaks and you can't build it locally. That happens all the time, and it's very frustrating. And it's more frustrating because the time is only given for those things when it's absolutely essential. And I think that we saw in this tech outage people just scrambling, and it's unfortunate because companies hire on so many people to build these projects, but they don't hire on to do a lot of maintenance. And maintenance is just as important. So when we build quality software, when we build systems that are resilient and last and are easy to develop in, we need to be thinking about, okay, we need to minimize the number of dependencies possible in every single project we do. So if we're building a React project, we need to keep the list of dependencies to a bare minimum. And we need to make sure we're looking at what dependencies are we actually bringing into our project. I was reading a book, or I am reading a book right now, and it's frustrating because it's a tutorial book and it's geared around .NET and React. And the suggested way that the book was going about telling you how to make a React app is to use Create React App. And if you ever have used Create React App, you know it puts in a ton of stuff that you don't even know what it does. It includes so many polyfills and so many dependencies that it just can become so wildly complex and hard to maintain, as opposed to going in and manually making it yourself and keeping it as slim and lightweight as possible. One way to detect this is, okay, how big is your bundled file? Is it large? How big is your dependencies list? It's okay, I guess, if your dev dependencies list is large, because those they don't get shipped out. But if your dependencies list is just cluttered with unnecessary dependencies, I would say that this is probably not, this might not be okay, because 5 years down the road, how hard is this thing going to be to maintain? Is a new team going to be able to come in and develop this? Are they going to be able to pull this code down and just hit F5 and it'll run on their machine? If that's not the case, we have to figure out how to make that the case. Same with .NET and NuGet packages. How many NuGet packages are we bringing in? Are they the most up-to-date packages? And if they're not the most up-to-date packages, are the packages that we're versioning to, are they secure? Are there any vulnerabilities? And what's causing us not to go to the latest supported version of this? Is it something in our broader architecture that we have to solve? Is it something that we have to have another meeting with a bigger audience and figure out? There's a lot of factors that go into this. It's not an easy task because it requires a lot of people from a lot of different areas to all come together and agree on updating a system, creating a plan to roll out the new version, and creating a plan to test. And all that takes a lot of time, a lot of resources, and it takes a lot of money. But it's really, really necessary. And I hope to get better at this, because I think it's beneficial for not just us as devs, but the company as well, because it makes more resilient and safer systems that aren't going to fail. And once you figure that out, everything's just going to get better. In terms of resilient systems when dealing with small projects with minimal dependencies, it's just as equally important to make a really, really simplified, streamlined logging system that really just works, that really just points you in the direction of where the problem is. Because nothing is worse when you go to try to figure out where your project broke because of some old dependency, and you look at the log statements and the logs don't give you anything. I think bad logs are worse than just having no logs at all, because bad logs can be very, very misleading, and they can steer a whole day away from what the root cause is. But if you have no logs, you might look in a spot where you may not have looked had you not read a log statement that just said something completely bogus. So writing clear logs that actually make sense, writing structured logs with indexes, writing logs that actually give you some kind of legitimate tracing throughout your system is absolutely essential. But it's important that we get that right at the beginning, because if we wait at the end, we wait till something breaks in our system to then go back and add these logs, is it really worth it? I mean, is it effective? Have the logs done what they mean to? Probably not. We need to be thinking about these things in the beginning of the project. But again, this takes design. It takes people. It takes money to do this. And I'm not suggesting that more people are going to make it move faster. That's not what I'm saying at all, because usually it's the opposite. I'm saying that sometimes it takes multiple teams in a coordinated effort to upgrade the whole system at large. So you might have one developer working on your API, but the API might be accessing a database that might just be outside of your team's scope of responsibilities, and then another team manages the database. So you might have to get in contact with that team to figure out, okay, we have to upgrade our database to, whatever version it is. Let's say it's like some old MySQL version. We gotta increase the version for whatever reason. You have to get in contact with that team instead of a meeting and do all that. It's not fun. Nobody likes to do it, and it's probably like the least favorite part of anyone's dev experience. But it's necessary to make this stuff not crash and to keep it secure, lightweight, and easy to develop in for anybody coming into the team. So anyway, that's all I want to talk about. Hopefully this was entertaining if you're listening to this. I know for me, I like listening to things kind of in the background. That's partially why I make these, just to have kind of a conversation with, I guess, myself, and just talk about things that I'm thinking through as I'm trying to study and get better at development. And really just thinking through, what would if I was 5 years earlier, what would I want to be listening to? What are the topics that I would want to hear talked about that aren't typically discussed in a way that's like beneficial? I'm trying to make content that is helpful, but get you thinking about stuff that maybe is not talked about that much. So I don't know, but I'll see you in the next one.